headlines that are appearing in all these papers, and you're writing alongside people from all of the big Indiana papers. So whenever we're at the Statehouse, we're by people from the AP, we're by people from the Indy Star. So yeah, I think it's really increased at least my confidence in my abilities. And like you said, we have a great placement rate and job. So as I'm graduating soon, I'm graduating in May, it makes me feel a lot more confident in the fact that I can do journalism as a job. And also it gave me so many different opportunities that I wouldn't have had if I went to a different school that didn't have this program.
Welcome to the News Nirvana podcast. I'm your host, Nick Parker. The News Nirvana podcast features conversations with media professionals from across the country, highlighting our ever-evolving business models and showcasing the strong and effective journalism produced each and every day. This podcast is made possible to you by the generosity of Town News. Town News delivers solutions, services, and guidance empowering local media organizations to thrive in an ever-changing digital world. Contact Town News today to learn more how they can help you thrive. Connect with them at townnews.com. Hello and welcome back to the News Nirvana podcast. With me this time is John Krull, director of the Pulliam School of Journalism and publisher of the StateHouseFile.com at Franklin College in Franklin, Indiana, as well as one of his students, Taylor Wooten, a senior and an award-winning journalist for the StateHouseFile.com. Welcome to both of you.
Good to be here. Thanks for having us.
We haven't had a chance to talk much on the student journalism side of things, so I'm a little excited about this and kind of how we're training the next generations and what the future of our news industry is going to be like. John, I want to start with you a little bit. When I first heard about you and I stalked your profiles and things on the internet, you talked a lot about storytelling and keeping storytelling, interchanging the words reporter and storytelling. And I thought that was really interesting to me because I remember when I was in school that we didn't really go that way. Reporting was a straight thing and storytelling was more for the movie makers and those TV people. But I like how you interchange the two and you make it about finding the best way to present the story that a reporter is working on. Can you talk to me a little bit about where you're coming from there?
Well, I think some of it is obviously that's what the market has driven us to do, in that people have now so many options, so many different ways to spend their time, that if you don't deliver the news and the information in a compelling fashion, you're not going to be able to hold the audience's attention. And, if you can't hold their attention, by definition, you can't inform them. So you failed at your job. And that's really what it comes down to. Me, even when I started in the business years and years ago, I never thought the kind of eat your vegetables approach to journalism was the way to go, that this just should be something people do because it was good for them. It really has to be something that that speaks to them and gives them a compelling reason to keep coming back and to pay attention. In addition to that, it makes the work of the storyteller a lot more fun. That's the challenge of it.
Has it made us better storytellers? Are we better at the job now?
Well, I mean, every generation's got its own challenges. And, it's sort of like getting drawn into that debate about, who's better, LeBron James or Michael Jordan. They played in different eras, and there's ultimately no way to resolve it. It strikes me instead that we focus on meeting the challenges that are before us now and that we anticipate. And in some ways, I think, at least for me, the advents in technology have made me a better storyteller than I was at the beginning of my career. But excuse me, if the technology hadn't changed and advanced so rapidly, I'd still hope that I was a better storyteller after doing this for several decades than I was when I first started. Otherwise, there's not much point in doing it.
Right. We should get better as we go along. I guess
Yes.
that's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked about how the market's kind of driven us to the change, and we've talked about this on this podcast a couple of times about we have to do a better job of meeting the audience where they are, and that means changing the way that we deliver the news, whether we're doing video or audio or the old printed thing, or slideshows, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just a photo slideshow is even a thing. So how are you as an instructor, and then we'll bring Taylor in kind of after this, but how are you as an instructor and a teacher leaning toward that and helping new reporters and new journalists figure out that best way to report the story, to present the story?
Well, I mean, it is thinking across media platforms, which students like Taylor have done exceptionally well. I mean, Taylor has, in addition to working effectively, we can't even really call it print anymore, in text. She's also participated in Emmy-winning documentaries and is comfortable, picking up a video camera and telling the story that way, and framing things. But I think part of it is just having an understanding of the audience and just how important it is to hold their focus, hold the audience's focus. Taylor's probably going to laugh here in a second because I use this example every time I teach a class, where I talk about, because people are so bombarded with information these days from all sources. There's so much stimulation. Your average audience, or your average listener, reader, or viewer, has the attention span now of a hyperactive 2-year-old who's hooked on crack. If you give them half a chance to look away, they will take it. And once you've lost them for good. So we really focus on storytelling without speed bumps, with nothing that gives the reader, or the viewer or the listener a chance to look away. And that's a skill that takes some time to master, but as we see with Taylor's experiences, if the student's willing to work hard, it can be mastered. So,
Taylor, were you already, as you came into journalism, and I guess the better question to start with is, did you know this was your career path from the beginning, or did you, like me, stumble into it and then they wouldn't let you go?
I feel like I almost stumbled into it. I kind of decided in high school that journalism sounded really important and that maybe I'd give it a try, but I came in freshman year, technically undecided, taking John's class. And what really got me into it, honestly, was when our former president was arrested and I had to help cover that. And it just made me realize just how important it is to tell those stories and to report really important news. And that was really what pulled me into journalism, for sure.
Nothing like a great breaking story to really let you sink in, right?
Right.
Well, and it speaks to Taylor's drive here. When that story broke, and I might add, it's less so now because it is kind of one of those pre-pandemic stories. It was a big deal right before we had 1 million people die over a couple of years. But for a place like Franklin College, it was a huge story. I mean, we made the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, USA Today, all of the national newscasts in ways that a college normally doesn't want to do. Taylor, were you a freshman or a sophomore when that broke?
I think at that point I was a sophomore.
Sophomore, but her focus really was on sports reporting. And, when this broke, actually, one of the executive editors of the paper at that time was away on a college trip down in Florida. The other was on a study experience in Japan, and we really needed someone who would step into that void. Taylor did that, and that's kind of why she has been so successful in her college career, is that that when there was a problem or there was a challenge, she didn't run away from it. She ran toward it and embraced it. And her stories were among the first that appeared on this, and she's continued to cover it, and presumably will be continuing to cover it when we head to trial next month. So
well,
finally,
Taylor, what was that like, moving over from sports beats to hitting a hard news story like this?
It was weird because it all happened so fast. It's not something I really thought about. It was just in our messaging channel, everyone's talking about, "Oh, I can't write about this right now. Who's gonna do it?" And I was just here at school. It was during what we call J term. It's just a period where people either go study abroad or they do internships, and I was the only person that was currently free. So suddenly it was like, "Oh, someone needs to call the police and get the records about this, and someone needs to write the breaking news story on it." So it happened so fast that it almost didn't feel like I was making a choice to like switch from anything, but it was also just so like both anxiety inducing and exhilarating at the same time. Like it was exciting in a weird way that people talk about how journalism is. Like you have these terrible events happen, but just knowing that you need to jump on it and get something out and make sure people have what they need. It was really weird, but and then from there, like I was helping with the continuous reporting on that. So it didn't feel like a conscious choice. It was just like there was a need to fulfill this role, so I was willing to do it, and I think I did want to get into more news type stuff anyways.
Well, I think, look, I think John will back me up here. It is okay to have pride in covering those big stories that, yeah, a lot of times they're horrible things. But
Mhm.
I think if you talk to anyone after their, into their careers, and you say, what are your most proud moments? They're probably going to be horrible stories that they had to cover, but they did the job and they did what they thought was well. I think John will probably back me up on that.
oh yeah, no, and I think it's often in times like that you need dedicated, ethical, and honorable people such as Taylor doing that work, because the cliche is obviously about journalists is that um, we're running up, we're the ones shoving the microphone into the grieving mother's face or whatever. They never really think about, okay, what's going on here is that if we're doing our jobs right, we're giving that grieving mother a chance to talk about something and let the rest of the community know what her child was like in life rather than simply in death. And that then allows other people to share her grief and to support her and to share in the mourning. A lot of our function is to be that place where parts of this vast community communicate, share experiences and thoughts with each other. And, that's what Taylor did a fabulous job. I might add, we had just rolled out a new website, I think, at the time. And it was a good thing that we did, because the traffic to our tiny little student newspaper website suddenly exploded when, for a brief moment, we had one of the biggest stories in the country, and everybody was going to the Franklin, the student newspaper, to try to find out what had happened.
Yeah, I like how you put that, and I kind of like to always tell people it's the one time when we should lean into the cliche. We should lean into the first draft of history, right? I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're doing, is capturing that moment, that time.
Yeah, and I'm going to brag on Taylor and her colleagues at the Franklin for a moment. They have competed and started out competing with some of the best news organizations in the country on a story that personally was difficult for them, because it happened at a school that they love, that they've spent a significant slice of their lives, and yet they've owned the coverage from day one, and have done a more thorough job, to the point where now sources up in Wisconsin where the arrest took place look to the Franklin as the place to break news now rather than the major outlets. And that's a tribute to the fact that not just that they've been aggressive, but also that they have been so ethical and fair in their dealings, and accurate. I mean, at least one of the sources up there says the reason that Taylor and her colleagues from our student newspaper are the only journalists they'll talk to is they're the only ones who haven't made a mistake yet in the coverage. So gotten something wrong, and that's because they've been scrupulously thorough in covering things.
Well, tell us a little bit about that coverage, Taylor. And look, we all love to be competitive in our business, right? And being the one that gets the story and gets the story right. But as you shifted over, and I'm sure you weren't really thinking about, hey, I'm a sports person now tackling news. You just went and did it. But tell me a little bit about your approach and how you attack that story.
Since it was like my first big news story, a lot of it was guided by John and like my older staff members that knew a lot of what they were doing. So at the beginning, I feel like it was a lot of like hearing what they thought needed to happen. And now at this point, it's like trying to understand court things, trying to understand charges. It's really weird and interesting. And we've just gone up to Wisconsin several times to cover the court proceedings, and it's a lot of learning new things as we go and trying to make sure all of it's correct. And
What were some unexpected things that you had to kind of dig in and learn on?
yeah, so I'd never covered anything like an arrest or anything similar to this. So it was all brand new, even having to call the police departments and just dealing with something so sensitive was brand new to me. So it was all really weird, and it's still all kind of weird because it's such a huge issue and it's so nuanced, and like you have to make sure you're getting every detail correct every time, which
How,
obviously you always want to do, but
you mentioned that you were leaning on experience from some other colleagues on your staff there, and you were leaning on the experience of your teacher. Yeah, so what was the team like that you had when you're covering this story? How many people are you talking about?
uh, not too many. Like I'd say there's probably 10 people in our editorial staff most of the time, and then we have John, of course, and then we have a few other professors that helped out. But when we actually physically went to Wisconsin, it was middle of COVID, so it was just me and John, and then we've kind of swapped out who's having to do that since we're all busy students. But yeah, it's probably at this point it's probably like 5 people. It's not a huge team, but it's enough to where we can swap out and help each other out throughout this story.
At one point, did you realize the size of the story, the impact that you were having with that coverage?
I feel like I just watched the page views, like John said, because we had a view counter at the bottom of the page, and I was just watching it reach like numbers that I'd never seen before. And that was when it was really crazy. And then I found out like the New York Times came out with an article about it, and then all the local TV stations were set up outside campus. So it didn't take long to realize how big of a story it was. And even when we first got like the email from the college saying that he'd been terminated, which kind of set off this whole thing, I think we were kind of in shock. Like I was with my boyfriend at the time, and I was like, "Did you get this?" And everyone on campus remembers where they were when it happened.
So I'm trying to figure out the timing. You said that was right before kind of the sky fell and we all went into various lockdowns. Was your campus closed at that point?
It was January 2020, so no.
So not quite.
Yeah, campus was, like I said, it's we have a J term thing where people they go home or they go to internships, so not a lot of people were here. But yeah, it was just before COVID took everything down.
How is the traveling and getting in with following up with your sources? You've had to go up to, you said, Wisconsin, where a lot of this is happening. How has that changed how you cover based on access, physical access?
I don't think it changed too terribly. Like I said, it was weird because we had to travel there, and John will attest that we had to ride there in a weird way. John was driving, and then I had to sit in the back seat on the opposite side. And we had to wear masks and have the windows open.
Yeah.
But once we physically got there, like, I'd say I guess the biggest difference is that we haven't had as much access to some people because some of the hearings have been through Zoom, or like some of the time, but we've had people go to Wisconsin just for former President Minor to just not be there, to be on Zoom instead, and it's kind of affects our access in that way. But I don't think it's been too terribly changed.
Well, it's interesting, though. I want to pick up, and I apologize.
Sure.
My phone's ringing in the background there. That every time we've gone up, often we always come back with something new and fresh that has helped to advance the story and help the audience kind of understand it. And that speaks to just the value of doing on-site reporting. It would be a lot easier for everyone involved. And believe me, I've gotten very, because I've made every trip with our student reporters, I've gotten very, very used to that stretch of interstate going all the way up to Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, for us to stay back there. But there is value in being able to see the site, to actually talk with the people, even if you have to wear masks. And, that has informed the coverage Taylor and her colleagues have done all the way through, because they were there. They could see it, they could know. And, they've learned a lot about developing relationships with sources so that people will take your calls when you need to reach them, and all of that. So it's I on balance, I would prefer that we'd never had the experience, but the students who have participated have made the most of it and learned a lot from it.
I'm curious a little bit about your role and how you you help out as the teacher and the advisor for this, because I'm sure there's a part of you that, look, you've been doing this a long time. You want to sink your teeth into a good story too. But I wonder, how are you, I guess, kind of what's the role you're taking as the teacher and an advisor, other than chauffeur, which I'm sure you're great at. But that relationship, I think, is always interesting.
Well, the way I see my role there is that I'm supposed to model the way you conduct yourself. Taylor and others have seen how I approach sources up there to get in, and I'm hoping that they learn at some level some tricks. I mean, part of the art of working with sources is that you've got to adapt it to your own personality. So things that might work for me wouldn't necessarily work for Taylor, and vice versa. But that they get the idea that this is important, that you treat your sources with respect and consideration and all of that. And then beyond that, it is with a big story like that, to provide some shelter and guidance, because it was a national news story. I wanted to make sure that a bunch of students up there covering it for a Franklin College news outlet wouldn't become part of the story themselves, that wasn't their job. So that's really how I see my role. I mean, in the long term, yeah, you're right. I still, what's the cliche when I hear a fire engine, I still want to race out and chase after it,
right?
Because of what I do and the way I was trained. But where I am at my life and my career now is I'm going to be more than thrilled if I make it as a footnote in the Taylor Wooten story, when she becomes a superstar. And that's really how I define success, is how well they perform, not necessarily how well I perform.
The News Nirvana podcast is brought to you by Town News, the creators of IQ Audience Plus. IQ Audience Plus replaces your old school, one-size-fits-all paywall with a smarter metering solution that targets visitors with custom offers, converting drive-bys into paying subscribers. Learn more at townnews.com/audience.
I want to shift gears just a little bit and go to over and talk a little bit about one of the other programs that you have at the college, the statehousefile.com. And I think this fits here because it's another thing where you're using your experience to create an opportunity for the students. This is Statehouse reporting from your college that is pushed out throughout the entire state of Indiana. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how it started?
Sure. Well, it evolved organically, and I'll tell you where we are now first, and then we'll go into how it evolved. But Taylor, who is up working at the Statehouse full time this semester for the second time, actually, she's such a glutton for punishment that she decided to step up and do it beyond the required amount. We provide, those students cover Indiana state government, state politics, and in many ways state cultural life, because during the summer we're still working and we'll do study commissions, but we'll also cover the state fair and all of that. We provide content for about 35 news partners in Indiana. Those partners pay us a minimal sum for the content, and what the college collects, we route back to students such as Taylor in the form of stipends or scholarships, because they're the ones doing the work, and they should get that. The way it evolved is that when I first became the director of the Pulliam School of Journalism many years ago, I also was the advisor of the student newspaper, the Franklin. And because Franklin is a small campus, at that time I had difficulty getting the reporters on the Franklin to stop interviewing their roommates for stories. Because that didn't resemble any part of the journalism world I knew. I thought that at that time the only way I could break that cycle was to get them out of that environment and take them out of their environment entirely. I had a friend who had some office space in downtown Indianapolis that he would loan us for the month of January, and I took a group of students up to cover the first month of the Indiana General Assembly that year. And, you know, I told some friends in the business that we'd be doing stories. We'd send them to them if they used them. Shows how quickly things have changed in the business. The only thing they had to do was give the student a byline, acknowledge Franklin College in some way, somewhere, you know, maybe at the base of the story. And this is the part that is really dated poorly. Send the student a tear sheet right. So that student would have it for her or his portfolio. We did that for a couple of years, and then I started getting calls from news editors and news directors saying, is there any way you could stop doing this or continue doing this beyond the end of January? My first reaction was no, not really, because I have to be back in class. The students have to be back in class come February 1 for the traditional semester start. That ended the discussion for about a year. And then they started calling and saying, what if we paid you to figure out a way to do this? Which changed the equation and the consideration and gave us this model so that we could figure out a way to give students this great experience and launching pad to jobs and internships. And I should say that the students who do the Statehouse file have pretty much 100% placement rate, and have found work even in a tight market consistently. But it also means that the students get yet another form of financial aid that defrays the cost of the college education, which, you know, again, in these days is really, really important. So it ended up being a win-win-win for everyone involved. It also allows a lot of news organizations to continue to provide to their audiences the kind of coverage that a Statehouse bureau traditionally would provide when they wouldn't be able to afford to do it any other way than the way we are providing.
Right. I'm gonna stick a pin in that because I do want to come back to that kind of talk about the gap of Statehouse reporting. But Taylor, you as he just said, you're a little glutton for punishment. You wanted to go back for a second a second tour on this. What is this experience doing for you as a reporter? What do you think it's giving you to make you better ready when you leave college to jump in as a professional journalist?
Like he said, it's so unique. It's taking almost an experience that you get in an internship or a real job, definitely like you get at a real job, and putting it into our curriculum. So you have bylines that are appearing in all these papers, and you're writing alongside people from all of the big Indiana papers. So whenever we're at the Statehouse or by people from the AP or by people from the Indy Star. So yeah, I think it's really increased at least my confidence in my abilities. And like you said, we have a great placement rate in jobs. So as I'm graduating soon, I'm graduating in May, it makes me feel a lot more confident in the fact that I can do journalism as a job. And also it gave me so many different opportunities that I wouldn't have had if I went to a different school that didn't have this program. And yeah.
To that end, can I step in for just a second,
sure.
Nick? 2 points I want to make. One is not long before we went on, we sat down to do this, I got an email from an editor at a paper up in northern Indiana asking specifically if we had any Statehouse students who would be looking for jobs or available. Taylor, you need to talk to me when we get done here because I need to give you that contact information. But they do that. I mean, those kinds of calls and contacts are routine. The other thing I don't want to let slip by here is what Taylor talked about, the confidence. I mean, Taylor, if we could roll back the calendar here and you somehow could step back into your 18-year-old self, would that 18-year-old believe you could be doing the kinds of things you're doing now? Not just in terms of the opportunities, but having the skills you've got.
Definitely not. I remember I started doing the Statehouse when it was all remote, and I just remember being like really shocked when I got like my first byline in my local paper at home. I remember I made my mom and my stepdad go out and buy it, and they still have like a collection. Every time I get one, I'm like, hey, it's published. But yeah, it was crazy, and I felt like the Franklin is obviously a real publication, but when it first started, it was just like, okay, well, I'm doing sports and I'm reporting to my fellow students. It doesn't feel quite as real. And now obviously I realize the importance of our student paper, but it feels a lot more real when you're like seeing it other places and getting that experience.
Well,
I'm sure too, when you stand right next to, you said you're standing right next to the AP bureau reporter or from the Indianapolis Star, right? I mean, so I would think in addition to the experience, just the connections that you're making. I mean, those are now your peers. Would you have had the courage to make those connections and those relationships back when you were 18 and you were walking onto the basketball court or whatever beat you were covering?
Definitely not. I still joke to our editor now that I almost feel like I like fangirl when I see the people, because they're people that I follow on Twitter and I read all their stories and I'm like, oh my God, I recognize her from this publication or whatever. And we get to walk past their offices every day. And it's definitely not something I'd feel comfortable with then. And it's still something I'm getting used to now, because most of my experience reporting has been remote, which is unfortunately the case for a lot of people right now, I'm sure. But yeah, it's definitely improved.
What do you like covering at the Statehouse? What are the stories that draw you in, that you really do want to chase and kind of sink into?
It's really hard to say, because I'm almost fine doing a little bit of everything. This session in January, the very beginning of January, our editor asked us, "What do you want to cover?" And I told her education. So obviously that's been a huge thing with a lot of nationwide trends. We have like 3 bills that are everywhere. Like they wanted to make school board elections partisan. They wanted to ban trans athletes from sports. And there's also the big CRT bills. So I've had a lot on my plate this session, and it's all been really interesting. And like people are passionate on both sides of all of these issues. So it's interesting to talk to people and try to boil down such complicated stories into something short that can be published and digested by people, and also that people want to read.
What how are you kind of what's the angle you're taking, I guess? How are you digging in on those to get past the platitudes, right? I mean, you just said, everybody's passionate about one side or the other on these stories, but how are you kind of digging in and finding to talk about the real things?
I think what it comes down to is paying a lot of attention to the testimony that people are giving on the issues, just because legislators can assert what they think the effects of things are going to be. But when it comes to like the education bills, there are students speaking on them, and there are teachers speaking on them, and there are parents speaking on them. And obviously, these people might have more experience than the guy that's up at the Statehouse half the year and owns a manufacturing company the other half of the year. Like it's a part-time legislature, so they're still normal people in a way, but they might not have these direct experiences and the direct impact of the bills that they are dealing with all the time.
How has it been getting sources for those stories and getting people on the record outside of testimony?
I'd say it's almost been easy in a way, because the fact that things aren't quite as remote anymore, but we still do have like the technology that kind of came out of the pandemic. So it's been nice to be able to still utilize Zoom, but also since these are really like kind of hot button issues, there's a lot of people that will come to the State House to speak about them and how they directly affected them. So it's been pretty easy to get people on the record, since they are passionate about these things and have a lot to say about how legislation would affect them in their real life.
As you sit back, John, what's it like watching that? Because these are stories that are all over the national news sphere, and her stuff is getting picked up.
Well, and I'll tell you what it is. The satisfaction I feel when I watch Taylor work now, and even watch her right now, in talking about this with you, it goes much deeper than pride. It isn't just that she's doing the story. I mean, if anything, she's underplaying the passions and the tensions. I mean, we've got people who are screaming at each other over a lot of this stuff. And part of what we try to prepare young people like Taylor to do is, even in those circumstances, to be the only cool head in the room, and to be the only one who is striving constantly to be fair and on point. And that's remarkable for any human being. But when you consider, Taylor, are you still 21 or are you 22 yet?
Still 21.
Still 21. That you've got a 21-year-old often being asked to be the adult in the room.
Right.
And that the 21-year-olds step up to do it. That's a remarkable thing. So, my admiration for what Taylor has done and how she's used her time at Franklin is immense, because one of the things I dislike about education is that about the education debate is so much of the focus is on the teacher and what the teacher does, when the reality is it's the student who's got to do the work.
Right.
It's the student who has to take the risks, and push herself to grow and learn new skills, and to do it in this case in front of what can be a massive audience. I mean, that's intimidating for anyone, but for a young person, just the level of courage and determination that Taylor has shown, is remarkable. So you know, I can't even really give voice to what I'm feeling when I watch her, because it's a remarkable thing.
Well, you should have pride as a teacher, and I want to stick on
Mm.
the educational side for just a second, and I'm curious as to your perspective. You said earlier you talked about role being a model to model behavior and action. So I run a small local news thing here in my town, little suburb of Kansas City, and we're currently interviewing candidates for a board of education and city council. And when I was 21 and 22, I'm not sure if I had the ability, based on lack of experience, to be the cool-headed one in these kind of interviews, right? So that it doesn't become argumentative.
Mm-hmm.
How are you? And granted, 25, 30 years ago or whatever, these issues weren't as heated as they are now. I think we act differently as a culture. But I guess what I'm curious is, you as an educator, how are you helping to train someone like Taylor, who's, she started doing the state at 20 and now she's 21 and doing it again. How are you working them so that they're prepared to be the cooler head and to ask the questions that get to the real part of the story, to get past the heated talking points?
Well, first place, I don't do it by myself. We've got a really dedicated team at Franklin College that works hard to model the appropriate kinds of ways that you do your job and you conduct yourself as a professional. You probably have noticed Taylor calls me by my first name. That's one of the things. We operate on a first name basis. One of the things that we try to signal is that we're going to function like a news gathering operation from day one. In my years in the business, I've never had an editor or a news director or a station manager who insisted on courtesy titles when I talked with them. So, we start with that we are all at some level peers. We're all trying to do the same thing here, which is tell the story fairly and well, and all of that. And then the other thing that we really try to do is much of the work that journalists have to do isn't abstract. So concrete, real life experiences help with the learning. It's not an original insight, but I'll obviously, and we obviously will borrow from the best of them. If you can find a way to make the world your classroom, then you're well on your way to creating solid learning experiences. And that's what we've done is ultimately gotten the market and the news market, and this is the part where they may be unwilling, even the politicians of the state of Indiana, to be collaborators in helping to educate young people like Taylor. So that's how we prepare them is by not saying to them, we'll stand at the edge of the pool and we're going to explain swimming to you. We put you in the water and say, okay, this is what you do. And if they start to sink, we pull them back up and try to explain what they did wrong. But without focusing on them as a person, but really on what went wrong in the process here, what mistake that might have been doesn't necessarily undermine your worth as a human being or as a professional or anything like that, because there are always mistakes that occur with learning. And then the problem is if you can't learn from those mistakes, if you can't grow from them, then that becomes a problem. I guess, speaking in the spirit of your question, in terms of modeling things, when I screw something up, I try to acknowledge it to them, and I try to own it.
If
And
we could
so,
only all be better at that one thing.
yeah, yeah.
in,
So, I
in
mean,
so many aspects.
that's it. But the bulk of it, and I don't want to take the focus away from Taylor and her fellow students, is that if they're not driven, if they're not willing to put in the work and take the risks and do all of that, nothing gets done. So the credit has to go to them, not to old fogies like me who are,
Well, I want to come back. I want to come back to we stuck a pin in this earlier. You had mentioned that one of the things that the statehousefile.com is doing is it's providing Statehouse reporting to 35 papers around the state of Indiana, and it's a thing that wasn't there. It had kind of gone away, and I feel like that's becoming a bigger trend around the country, that there just aren't as many Statehouse reporters anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There definitely are fewer Statehouse bureaus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is a program like this and the success that you're seeing, is that showing the importance of that role in our jobs as journalists, and maybe can show that we need to make more effort to bring that back or to rebuild? Maybe bring it back is probably too strong, but rebuild and
well, yeah, I think where it really, and I'd be interested in hearing Taylor's thoughts on this too, because as I get reminders every day, increasingly I am part of the past and Taylor is the future. But I think we're going to have to rethink it, and to rethink how we fulfill this very important role that we journalists play, particularly in covering things like the Statehouse. I mean, part of the reason that it's not like 25, 30 years ago, newspapers all over the country said, oh, geez, we're really sick of covering state government. We're just going to yank reporters away from there because we don't want to do it anymore. Economic forces forced them into that position because, in the traditional models, providing Statehouse coverage was expensive. Unless you were, in your area, it's not like somebody can commute back and forth from Kansas City, to Jeff City, easily on a daily basis, particularly if there are legislative sessions where, the lawmakers are staying in session until midnight or 1 a.m.
Right.
You almost have to have a reporter or a bureau present there all the time, which means that you got to figure out things like how you create office space, all of those things, and it's an expensive thing. That's why a lot of the smaller papers, in particular here, and smaller news operations got out of the Statehouse business, is they couldn't afford it any longer. And that created really the opportunity in those calls I was getting about, is there any way you can continue doing this, was for that reason. What I try to tell news editors and news directors is that, yeah, we can do this, and help you out, but whatever money we save you in that regard, funnel back into covering your local communities. Don't just put it in your pocket, because no one is going to find a not-for-profit model to cover city and county government in Lagodi, Indiana, or
right,
or small communities, and that's a problem, because they can do unchecked city county or county councils can do just as much damage as the state legislators can, and they need to be watched and reported on as well. So but I mean, the numbers, you look at it, surveys show that we're either at the low end at about 25 to 33% of the number of Statehouse reporters we had 15 years ago. At the high end, it tops out in the mid 40s, so it's less than half
Right.
of what it once was, and that's a huge problem.
Taylor, I think we're both curious as to your kind of thoughts and opinion on this, on the importance of having Statehouse reporting that papers around the state can pull from and rely on.
Yeah, I think that what made me decide that I wanted to do journalism was the idea of that watchdog function, like where we're sitting in these several hour long meetings and picking out things that people otherwise wouldn't have known, that normal people don't have the time to spend their entire day watching 7 hours of testimony on a bill. So I think that it does fulfill an essential thing where we're letting people know what their legislators are doing. Like a lot of these local papers will pull out our content just to say, hey, this person voted in favor of this bill or this person voted against the bill. Like your local legislators are playing a role in this legislation. And if you care about this issue, maybe you should vote differently, or maybe you should vote the same way if you support it. So yeah, I think it's important to fulfill these news deserts where these people aren't getting all the information they need, and be kind of an essential part of the democracy in telling these people who the people they're voting for are and what they support and what they don't. And I remember in not early 2020, but late 2020, it was crazy to me that like we learned that the legislators didn't have to wear masks, and they were the people enforcing other people wearing masks. So it was all very interesting, and just things like that you pick up on that other people might not know about in the state, that don't pay quite as much attention as a Statehouse reporter is required to, need to be broadcasted.
I think that's a great place for us to start wrapping up here. And I think John, your teacher there, and people listening will like hearing your passion for taking on the role and getting ready to come out. I like that you want to be the watchdog. Do you want to do Statehouse reporting after you graduate in May? Or are you just looking for wherever you can be the watchdog?
I think Statehouse reporting would be pretty cool, but like you said, it's hard because there's like not a lot of resources for it. So at any given publication, maybe they want one Statehouse reporter, maybe they don't want any. So yeah, I'm okay with wherever. I'm looking everywhere, but I think that would be cool, and it'd be working off of things that I already have a good knowledge of.
Well, for anybody listening, and you've got a good reporter role open, call Franklin College. There's going to be some graduates there that are ready to go work.
Specifically, call Taylor Wooten.
There you go.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be mean and single out and take away from any of your other students. I'm assuming, John, you have multiple good students.
Oh yeah, we do. But, Taylor stepped up and did this. She, after she gets her job, we'll work on the next one.
There we go.
Yeah.
John, Taylor, I appreciate you taking some time today just to tell us a little bit about what's going on at Franklin College and how you are working and the things you're doing at the Statehouse. I do think that's an important thing for us to figure out as an industry, is how to financially make that work again so that we can have the watchdogs in the state capitals. It's a good thing. So thank you both very much for your time.
Thank you for having us. This was a fun conversation.
Well, that will wrap us up for this episode of the News Nirvana podcast. We'll talk to everybody next time.
The News Nirvana podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or most any of your favorite podcast apps. The News Nirvana podcast is made possible by the generosity of Town News. Connect with Town News at townnews.com. The News Nirvana podcast is produced by Fredcasts. Think, speak, act,